Hello, today I want to look at a couple of things, and I'm going to begin by thinking about something that we introduced very early on, the idea of how we have this feeling, this sense of like holding apples under the arms, or in the knee pits, in the elbow pits, in the wrists, and this sense of roundedness in the body, and how important this is in Yiquan. And if you remember, I talked about the idea that in the Yiquan guard, like the fetishization of this posture and changing it into a guard like this isn't the right way of thinking about it. That actually what we want is this feeling, and it doesn't really matter where our guard is, and if we change our guard in different positions, we want to keep this feeling. So I've seen one interesting thing and one not very interesting thing. So I've seen that there's a video that someone put out, and it's something like, the reason why Yiquan people have their elbows out like this. That I don't really want to speak about that person and what kind of person they are. But the video itself, I just thought was a very good example of the trivialization of Yiquan, and that people who don't really understand the method kind of start thinking in certain ways, or try and work out from the outside why things are done like that and try and reverse engineer it. And it's very much the opposite of what Wang Xingyiquan talked about understanding intuitively and unlocking that knowledge and why things are happening. So, I mean, a couple of the things that person says are along the right line. So the idea of being springy and defensive, but if you can't do it, you don't really understand why or how that works. And if you can do it, then you understand that it's not about sticking your elbows out. It's about this feeling of roundedness. And we use this idea of holding apples in different parts of the body to just kind of get across this idea of roundedness. It's about that, and that doesn't matter. That's everywhere in the whole body. It's not just in your elbows. The other thing that he talks about was the idea that it comes from this. So again, this idea of fetishizing the basic zhuang, that you do this and then you change, and then that gives you your elbow stuck out. And he says, well, obviously, if that's your basic training, then that's going to be your basic guard. Which doesn't make any sense, of course. Like, if it doesn't explain why you would have a posture like this with your elbows stuck out, it doesn't explain that. You could just change it, couldn't you? You could just do any kind of guard you want, and then you'd have a different, you could have a guard like this, and it doesn't explain why you have a guard like that. So it puts the cart before the horse, and it's very much this idea I've talked about before, that Confucius talks about, that you start burying people in the ground, and then you start like building all the ideology around that. All the spiritual stuff comes after the physical event, and I've linked that to martial arts and say, like, when people don't really understand the system, like they start developing the ideology around it, and he does something very much like that as well. Also, again, talking about Xingyiquan coming from spear, which Yao Zhongzhong very much didn't believe that story. It's like the ideology comes afterwards to justify the linear movement. If the guard posture just came from this, I mean, that's quite a trivial, and it's not an explanation at all. So it's like, the next thing is, well, why do this then? These are the key things that really need explaining, and people who really understand the system it's one of the indications of why someone's explanation is right or wrong. So I don't want to go too far into what that person says, but then I saw quite a good video of Xingyiquan that I'll put in the link description, of someone doing Xingyiquan horse punch, which is something you see that comes through very much into Yiquan, and you still see some Yiquan people do a version of it, particularly those people associated with Hans Yiquan. It's not my specialist area, but the posture is very much like this. I'm laughing at my own inability to do it right. Like that, and it's very narrow sort of punch like this, straight through. And you can see all the Xingyiquan principles. You don't always see people do the setback route, like sometimes just see the follow-on route like that without a setback. But the setback route makes it more, I'm improving the posture by doing it like that, I have to say. Like that. And this hand is usually quite low like this, and it just punches straight through like this. And this very much uses this idea of the Farley that comes from the horizontal axis. And the idea that I want to recap, just very briefly, is the idea of structural expansion that I began talking about right at the very beginning when we started talking about standing in the basic Yiquan guard. And just by understanding the things that I've been talking about all along, and then just comparing and contrasting with the Xingyiquan way of doing it, you have to look at the video, obviously it does it a lot better than I do. You can see the truth, you can unpack and understand the truth and the correct way of understanding this, that there's a change from this kind of very linear, it uses this kind of hitting forward, like the kind of thing you would headbutt, and the kind of thing we've talked about as the use of the horizontal axis to release force, and we've contrasted that with the rotational axis Farley. And those are by no means the only variations that we need to look at, I have to say. And if you can get the posture, you can try yourself and feel the difference. That if you do it like, ooh, he's going, and that's one of the problems with these very linear inline stances, and it's one of the reasons why you're much better off doing a kickback routine with a wider. Can't think of a better explanation of why that's actually quite a danger. I don't care how good you are, that's going to happen at some point if the force just hits at a funny angle. But say we do it backhand, and yeah, okay, it's going to sting right on your nose, but the point is about maximising power generation. So one of the key innovations in each one that you can see is the idea of postural expansion, that when you form a configuration, when you hit into the lock point and form a configuration, that the posture expands into the, it's not very linear like that. Xingyiquan kind of posture like this, it expands into the posture like that. That increases power, and you can feel it straight away. This idea that I talked about all the time, that we use this somatic movement and the somatic timing, and that if we do it very limited like that, we're still using that somatic timing. We can use it in a very narrow way like that, but by narrowing it down like that, it's kind of postural shrinking, that you eliminate power that you could otherwise generate. And you can feel it straight away if you just change from being like that, and you just change into, and you can see the extra movement straight away, and the extra reach that's generated in the movement. And all that's required then is just to shift the foot out a little bit and root it a little bit better than you normally see in Xingyiquan. The best Xingyiquan, you see the brace root in the back leg, but in a lot of Xingyiquan it's just kind of rooted on the front leg, and the back leg just follows on. So again, it's a significant improvement in each one that the posture sets and roots from both legs. And when you change it into this, and you can think about it as expansion, like the posture just expands into a much bigger frame, and it's overdetermined in multiple different ways. So just as I've just demonstrated, it's bigger, you get a longer reach, but also it's more movement around the axis. So this is quite a limited, to get power around this, you've only got a very short movement, and particularly if you start moving in it's a very short. I'm making it less powerful than it could be, I have to say, so let's try and do it with more power. See how I can get my Xingyiquan. See, and again, that's a good example of like the problem that was faced in each one, that when they started trying to do combinations like that, they faced this difficulty, that it's very difficult to use you've got the hit and relax, and you see that emphasised quite a lot in some Xingyiquan. They hit and they really emphasise the relax after after the posture. To make it go into another posture to form a combination is very difficult because it relies on compensatory power. And remember, I talked about the idea of using steps for compensatory power. And what it's compensating for is this is such a short movement from this kind of release of force from this part of the body is such a short movement that you need to add compensatory force, like get more of the body weight moving forward into the posture. You need to use that compensatory force, and that starts becoming a real problem when you want to use combination punches, and that's why we only really see a couple of combinations usually. I think I mentioned before that the only combination you ever really see is this. And yeah, I don't see why. There's no reason really when you think about it. Like if you use your somatic timing, you can do it like that and use compensatory force with the steps like that. But the more postures you start adding on, the more problematic it starts being. And again, it's overdetermined in multiple different ways for that being a problem, because just like we saw before, it's too narrow a stance. It's too narrow a stance, and it's too using the body. It's not conducive to higher levels of opponent who are moving more around. You know, all of a sudden they move over here, and you can change a bit, but then they move over here, and it's like it starts becoming a really stiff way of moving, rather than you can see in each one straight away what a revelation it was to start thinking like, oh, we'll move, you know, we're going to move like this, and we're going to, you know, just breaks it free from that really rigid kind of footwork. I'm being circumspect about it. I mean, I'm looking at a lot of Xingyiquan, some researching and thinking about these ideas, and I may yet find those missing link pieces where people are starting to use combinations, and the somatic timing is there in Xingyiquan. You just hardly ever see it used, and I can only assume that it just didn't evolve to that degree in most cases because it wasn't necessary, either because people weren't really fighting or because it was really successful, one or the other, or possibly both. You know, maybe it was just enough. I mean, it's going to sting, isn't it? Like someone's like, and they hit you right on the nose. It's going to, if they can get you right on the nose. And making it stronger by using the kickback routine. Usually you don't see that in Xingyiquan like that. When you change that, it's a really obvious logical change that when you start thinking about different kinds of power generation, and you expand the posture instead, and instead of keeping it narrow like that, you expand the posture, and just by expanding it in the process of expansion, that you can change to rotational Farley. So I think one of the things that we can identify here is like a link point between Xingyiquan and early Yiquan. Quite difficult really it's not impossible, but it creates new problems. If you want to combine, if you want to think about, I want to use more rotational Farley to generate power, if you start thinking about power generation and you start introducing that idea of rotational Farley, so you start taking it away from just using this kind of horizontal axis Farley, the quad axis Farley, and you start thinking, I want to use more rotational Farley with this, and this is the early kind of each one that we see, like this. In a way, it kind of explains that kind of shift to this more rotational punch, because it really lends itself to this, the lean over to the side like this, which is one of the ways really that you start. It's one of the solutions to the problems. Well, how do I want to generate more force, and I want to start including rotational Farley around the vertical axis. How do I combine that with rotation around the horizontal axis? And it can be done, but there's always got to be compromises. So the easiest way to do it, of course, is just to lean like that, because otherwise you're going to lean like that forward and you're going to be punching like that and you're still leaning anyway. So leaning like that into the... So the question is, why do this bigger, rounder movement like that? Why lose this direct directional force, which one would think is more powerful because it's more structurally integrated. If you hit like kind of up like that, at this point there's a lot of pressure on the elbow, just like I talked about in a previous video where you do the hammer fist like that. It's less structurally integrated with the overall structure, but what it does have is that it's a really good example of postural expansion. It's like the whole posture expands into the... And you can use this kind of fast whip up with and hit in with the hand. And this is what you see people who trained with Yaozongzun earlier, generally speaking, have this kind of movement. I think this is the missing link. They've gone from the Xingyiquan use of horizontal axis, they've combined it with the vertical axis. It's inevitably led to this kind of lean forward like that, because otherwise you're just that. And then rather than just pushing straight out like that, they've gone for the big expansion like that. This is how to kind of solve or the feeling itself, the feeling and the movement of the posture they're moving. Just kind of suggests this, and you can really get some, whip on it, and it kind of looks a little bit more like, it's like circular Xingyiquan, so you can see how that would, yeah. Actually kind of at the same time, because of just looking at the ages of the people and who they trained with, and some trained with Wang Shengjai, that you start also seeing like this kind of moving to the side like that. Don't forget when I say like people who trained with Yaozongzun earlier kind of doing that's very often not his sons. Like intuitively you think, well, his sons must have been training with him like from being kids, which they were, but actually there's people training with Yaozongzun earlier than that who were a lot older than the Yao brothers. So it's actually a significantly different way to the way that the Yao brothers then change it later on, particularly into this kind of use of the pivot root and the straight. And the head moves a little bit. It doesn't have to, by the way. It can just be round the axis, particularly when we use faster somatic timing, but usually just moves a little bit. So we're now emphasising much more of the rotational Farley, whereas, as we've talked about before, this posture really emphasises the horizontal Farley, and we have talked about that idea before. When it changes, it emphasises much more of the rotational Farley round this axis, and the head can move a little bit to the side either way like that. 1, 2, and this is a little bit of the slingshot power with the complementary rooting 1, 2, and then there's multiple different variations you see, even like actually between the Yao brothers, and then some of their students do some different things and different variations, and some people have improved things and some people have made things worse. This being the worst and this being the best improvement to get the whole. So remember when I talked about when we do a jab, we lift and we turn the body like this. And what this does is it starts reversing the process back again. You see the genius of it. So from this way, really emphasising the horizontal axis. This does the other thing when you start using the pivot root and doing this different way of doing it, and much more direct in line with the structure, so you get more transmission of force into the posture. You take away the whipping force from doing that and the hard set, and you change it into so you can't even hear the set really, unless you do it like, so you still can't hear it. The ball of the foot is setting, unless I really emphasise it with a kickback route, you can't really hear it. So I talked about all of that before. And when we start bringing it back into this, we're actually doing the other thing now, like we're using instead of the horizontal axis going forward like that, the horizontal axis is now going back. And instead of, we've still got the little bit of the rotational Farley, but actually it's significantly more now when we do it like this. So it almost reverses the entire body mechanics of doing that. And the reason for doing that all along is just evolution. It's just like, how do we develop more power? Also, like, how is it structurally integrated with the reality of the fight and fight practice, and how do we integrate it with other movements? And again, this is not like, it's not as conducive to using combinations as using the pivot route is, because it just creates this really great way of using our routing that is highly complementary, and also being up on the ball of the foot then just helps us to do other things like, you know, fluidly moving into kicks like that. It's already up and then, so it's just great for overall combinations, and it's great for like springing off and moving like that. So it's over-determined in multiple different ways. Anyway, the important point I wanted to get across was the idea of structural expansion itself, from going from this very narrow way of using Xingyiquan, that it's not about that's what you do with a spear. It's nothing to do with that. Like I said before, like, you know, fighting with your hands is nothing like fighting with a spear. There's totally different considerations. That idea comes afterwards as the ideology to justify a very linear movement. We still see that in martial arts all the time. Various excuses for why things are the way they are, despite the obvious realities that they shouldn't be like that. Then we change from this very narrow thing and we use structural expansion as just straight away. When we combine that then in with the later kind of doing the Yiquan basic punches and basic movements, now we see you see it kind of bloom, that it was kind of being held, it was being held back, it was being repressed. Even by this kind of movement, it's being held back, it needs to be. And this really, just as you expand into the posture, it really feeds into the somatic timing, the relaxation of the muscle movement. And it also just gets more on the rotational fallacy, so it feeds more into the equation that generates force. And it's just better then links in with this structure for delivering that force to the contact point. We can see how that historically developed like that. And that absolutely doesn't come from, oh, we do standing like this, so when we change like this, then, well, it's just our basic guard, isn't it? Like, it obviously doesn't make any sense. This is an Yiquan zhuang, you know. I mean, there's no limit of zhuangs. This is, you know, this is, but those aren't guards, you know, so there's this. It's not a guard, it's the feeling of the structural expansion. You can see it come straight away, like from the kind of zhuangs that are done in Xingyiquan. Straight away, it's a completely different. Like, the hips relax out, everything becomes much more rounded. And the zhuangs are completely different because they're trying to capture this feeling of structural expansion. And then when you do loads and loads of standing, you will have this will become like a second natural feeling. And sometimes even when you just sat down watching the telly or something like that, you can almost feel like you just want to form into that. In fact, sometimes, very often do, just watching the telly, will just, with my arms resting on the sofa or something like that, I'll do, because it just starts to feel like you're natural. And that's over-determined again, because this is much more conducive to defence. And it's got lots of weaknesses as well, but it's much more conducive. It's this springy triangular structure, and you can see that that's how it functions.